Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are taking a look at Swords of the Emperor, a guide to the identification of Imperial Japanese swords 1873 to 1945 by John Plimpton. This is the fourth book from Headstamp Publishing, which I am a partner in, and we're very happy to have it printed in our warehouse and available ready to ship now. You may recognize this from our launch of it a while back or from its inclusion in our most recent Kickstarter as part of a Japanese book bundle, but Swords of the Emperor is now here, available, ready to ship, so figured we should take a closer look at it. I think the first of all, this is a guide to the identification of Japanese imperial swords. It is not explicitly a history of these swords, and it focuses on the fittings, the accoutrements, not the blades. There are other books out there that cover the blades of Japanese swords, how those were made and how they're unique and interesting. For our purposes, blades are sort of a secondary element because the identification and the change in the swords really took place in the handles, the grips, the pommels, the guards, all of the other accoutrements, the elements outside of the blades themselves. So 1945 is a pretty obvious delineation point. One might ask, why 1873? What's the deal with 1873? And the answer is, of course, prior to the mid-1800s, the 1860s, Japan practiced a pretty effective form of isolation. They didn't really want any contact with the outside world. They had only very minimal contact with the outside world until Commodore Perry sails into Tokyo Harbor and essentially forces Japan to interact with the outside world, or at least with the United States, which then turned into dealing with the entire world. As part of this opening up, the Japanese emperor realized that the military was not really in a good position. The Japanese military was not on par with its European counterparts. Japan wanted to be recognized as a world power among equals, and if they're going to do that, they have to basically totally reform and revamp the military. This is not that long after the samurai have been disbanded. But samurai don't do so well against the up-and-coming industrial firepower that you see with armies by the 1860s and 1870s. So Japan originally actually picks the French as a military force to specifically emulate. After the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese kind of pivot a bit and decide maybe they should follow the Prussian-German model instead. But either way, they're basing the new Japanese military on a European model, and swords are a part of that. So we're used to picturing the classic two-handed katana of the samurai. The Japanese military swords that were adopted starting in 1873 are very much modeled on European military blades. So they're single-handed, they're small blades. They are, to the untrained eye, indistinguishable from French, British, German officers' swords of that period. So that's where we begin here. And the Japanese had a ton of interesting variation on their swords. They would go through a series of new patterns every few years, or new patterns every few years. And then each one of those patterns varied in complexity and in its decorative elements based on sort of the level of the sword. Is this a sword for a non-commissioned officer, for a sergeant, or is this a sword for a general or for, aristocracy at the imperial court? And so you'll see in a specific pattern that the general form remains the same, but the swords get fancier as the rank increases. And so what Plimpton has done in this book is give you a really good guide to, here is the army pattern of 1875, and here's the variation from the lowest grade up to the highest grade. There were many different variations of these swords. The Army had its own line of swords. The Navy had a line of swords. Those are the obvious ones. And then the book also includes chapters on a whole bunch of other subcategories. So the civil service had swords. There were specific swords for firefighters, for the police, for the Japanese colonial service. The Empire of Japan was very much a colonial empire. It controlled areas like Korea, areas like the Philippines, occupied a lot of areas in the 1940s. But Japan had a colonial empire prior to World War II. and it had a colonial administration system, and those guys had their own distinct patterns of swords. There were presentation swords from the emperor. There were specific court swords that were worn in the emperor's court. There were, well, an interesting one is the Japanese marine swords. This was the Japanese Marines were a very short-lived military branch. They were formed in 1870. They were abolished in 1876. They were based on the British Royal Marines. They had their own swords. We have an example of one of those in the book as well. And then even, a little farther down the sort of less common scale, we have things like boys' swords for young boys who are in the aristocracy or in the military, going to enter into the military. Toy swords, you name it, it's in here. This is a pretty darn thorough identification guide to the blades of the Japanese Empire. By the way, of course, in 1934, 1935, a wave of nationalism really kind of comes over Japan. Much more of an idea of looking back to Japan's golden years in the past, sort of a stereotypical thing. But they transition from the Western European style of small blades to going back to something that looks very much like the traditional katana for their military swords. And so those are, of course, covered in here as well. And it's interesting to see the transition from the European style back to the traditional Japanese style. And then, of course, those Japanese swords degrade in quality as World War II continues, as production becomes more and more difficult. You essentially have a last-ditch version of several of these sword patterns that was being made right up to the very end of World War II. So that's another really interesting element to take a look at. There are then a number of useful appendices in the book. There's a whole appendix on the tassels and knots that are attached to the swords. There's an appendix on Japanese imperial officer ranks, the various symbols, colors, and elements that are associated with the different ranks in the different branches of service and different branches of government. So another really useful appendix there. Overall, if you are interested in Japanese imperial swords, I think this will be a pretty essential book to have. The photography is the typical Headstamp, gorgeous photography. And, well, you've seen it already. We've been flipping through the book this whole time. So cost on this is $130. This is printed entirely in the United States, which is why it cost us more than previous books that we have printed in China. A lot of people wanted a book printed in the US, and frankly, for a book that talks about some of Japan's interference in China, this is one that we weren't so sure would be easy to print in China with their censorship policies. So printed in the US means a little higher cost, but also meant that's one of the reasons that this was able to get printed and into our hands a little bit faster. There is only the one version of this book. We don't have an author-signed copy. We don't have a collector's edition. It is just the standard book with its fantastic white, red, and gold cover. So hopefully you guys enjoy. By the way, if you ordered a copy of this as part of the Kickstarter Japanese bundle, your copy will be shipped when the other books in your order come in. If you ordered a copy as part of our initial launch just by itself, your book may have already shipped by the time you see this video. It will certainly be shipping soon. We have the books in. It's just now a matter of processing through all the orders and getting them out. So if you've already ordered a copy, it is essentially on its way to you now. If you haven't ordered a copy, I know there are a lot of people who prefer to wait until the book's actually in the warehouse to order one. Well, now it is. This is your opportunity. I have a link to Headstamp's page for Swords of the Emperor in the description text below that you can take a look at. Thanks for watching.